He must be somebody who was with God in some sense and dwelt in his presence and knew him intimately, immediately. Moreover, this prophet would have to perform miracles in the sight of all Israel. Shadid mentioned that the Jews continued to look for a prophet even after the time of Joshua and others. The reason they did is because Deuteronomy 34 says that even after the time of Moses' death, which is when Joshua succeeded him, we're told that there still had been no fulfillment of this prophecy. Nobody had yet come after the manner of Moses who performed miracles like Moses in the sight of all Israel. So now we have a third criteria. The prophet must be an Israelite. He must have an immediate face-to-face knowledge of God, and he must perform supernatural signs and wonders. Think about it. Muhammad, none of these things were true of Muhammad, right? Even if one of them were not true, he would not be that prophet, but none of these things are true. Muhammad was not an Israelite. He was an Arab. Muhammad did not have a face-to-face knowledge of God. The Quran never claims that. Aisha repudiates that notion repeatedly. Remember his child bride, who was 6 years old when he married her, 9 when he bedded her. That Muhammad did not have a face-to-face knowledge of God, according to his child bride. That person also did not perform any miracles. In fact, the Quran says that the people said to Muhammad, "Why aren't miracles sent down upon him like those that were sent to Moses?" They explicitly raised the issue. And then Muhammad makes an excuse. Oh, well, people in the past didn't accept or believe the miracles when they saw them. That's irrelevant. The prophet that came in, that was going to come in the manner of Moses, would have to perform miracles. Now, Shadid said a number of things about Jesus not being the prophet. I want to say here, I have no burden to prove that it is Jesus. My observation here is not to say that it is Jesus, but to say that his reasons for saying it isn't simply don't wash. He said that in John chapter 6, Jesus denies being like Moses. That is not what's going on in John 6. In John 6, Jesus has just fed a multitude of Israelites in the wilderness, just like Moses did. And so Jesus makes an analogy, or he uses this as an analogy to say, this is pointing to me as the true bread, right? Moses fed the people in the wilderness bread from heaven. I have fed you bread miraculously, but this all points to me. I'm the true bread. But he performed a miracle just like that which was sent to Moses. In fact, if you look at John chapter 6, how did the people respond? Indeed, doesn't apparently seem to be interested in how Jesus or John or whatever interpret the prophecy of the prophet. He's more concerned with what the religious leaders who opposed them thought. But notice that in John chapter 6, after Jesus performed this miracle of feeding the people in the wilderness, it says, when the people saw the sign which he had performed, they said, this is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. So according to the people of Israel, when they saw Jesus performing miracles in their midst, this Israelite who claimed to have a face-to-face knowledge of God. In fact, in John 5, Jesus said, you have never at any time heard his voice or seen his form. The idea is, I have, you haven't. That Jesus performed signs, that Israelite performed signs in their midst, and they responded by saying, this is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. They thought from the signs that he was the prophet. And this is really what we already see back in John 1, when Jesus comes to Nathanael, and you have that whole encounter there. No, it says that the next day, this is still John 1:143. The next day he purposed to go into Galilee. He found Philip and Jesus and said to him, Jesus said to him, follow me. Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Okay. Now, again, my point here is not to argue that Jesus is the prophet. That's not the thesis of our debate. I'm only pointing out that's how Jesus is presented by his apostles. That's how the crowds saw Jesus in light of his miracles. That's certainly what Jesus actually confirms in John chapter 5 when he says, you search the scriptures thinking that in them you have eternal life. These scriptures testify about me. He says, you've placed your hope in Moses, but if you believe Moses, you'd believe me because he wrote about me. Again, I'm not arguing that Jesus is the prophet. I may believe that. All I'm pointing out is this is what Jesus said. This is what John said. It's not my burden to prove that in this debate. The only burden I have is to prove that Shadid's case that this is Muhammad is utterly bankrupt. It's utterly bankrupt. Muhammad was not an Israelite. He did not perform signs and wonders in the sight of Israel. He did not have a face-to-face knowledge of God. He was not that prophet. But I mentioned earlier that Moses was, God said when he distinguished Moses from others, he says, how are you not ashamed to speak against my servant Moses, right? Not so with my servant Moses. With him I speak face to face. The distinctive title used for Moses throughout the Old Testament over and over and over again is the servant of the Lord, the servant of God. When you read Moses's writings, this is the reason this is important. When you read Moses's writings, Moses is the one who effected Israel's deliverance from Egypt. He delivered them from temporal bondage by the power of the Lord. But Moses realized that this was only a typical redemption, meaning it wasn't that ultimate redemption that the people needed. This affected their physical, temporal deliverance, but they still had hearts that were not right with God. The true sacrifice had not yet been given. So Moses constantly rebuked and upbraided the people and says, you do not have circumcised hearts and ears. But he told them that in the latter days, God would give them a circumcised heart. In other words, he's saying God is going to bring about a new Exodus, but this new Exodus is going to bring about that spiritual deliverance that you need. The prophets pick up on this over and over again and speak of a new Exodus that God is going to accomplish in the future. Read Jeremiah 30 through 33. He likens the future redemption to the previous Exodus. But what's most significant of all is if there's going to be a new Exodus, then there also has to be a new Moses, a new servant. And the prophets tell us who that new servant would be. Jeremiah 30, in the context of talking about that new covenant, that new Exodus that God was going to bring about. Jeremiah 31, he says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord. I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel. In that promise, he says that God is going to circumcise the heart. He's going to pour out his spirit. God is going to forgive their sins. On what basis? Jeremiah tells us. In Jeremiah 30, he says that he's going to raise up for them. Listen to the words of Jeremiah 30. In Jeremiah 30, it says, their leader shall be one from among them. Sounds like Deuteronomy 18, doesn't it? Their ruler shall come forth from their midst, and I'll bring him near. He shall approach me. You shall be my people, and I'll be their God. In Jeremiah 23, he says of him, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he'll reign as king and act wisely. The prophecy goes on to say, this is the name by which he'll be called, the Lord our righteousness. Later, the prophet Zechariah refers to this one as, it says, behold, I'm going to bring in my servant, the branch. I'll remove the iniquity of this land in a single day. That is through the branch. And the branch is called my servant. Okay. The point that I'm making here is Muhammad doesn't meet this criteria. Muhammad was not an Israelite. He did not know God face to face. He did not perform signs and wonders. And he certainly didn't accomplish this spiritual new Exodus. He did not bring about that which was necessary to renovate the heart. He did not pour out the spirit that God had promised. He did not accomplish the true sacrifice that would bring about the forgiveness of sins. The thing, the true servant, the true prophet, the true new Moses.
We need to keep with time.